All right, let's take a look at some small block Mopar offerings. On the left here, you've got a stock 5259 Magnum head. In the center, you have an out-of-the-box 5259 Magnum head. I've removed the springs and the rocker studs, put some die chem on it, but I haven't touched it with a grinder, altered the ports or the chambers or anything in any type of way yet. And then on the right here we have the same head. Those two came together in a pair, and the one on the right is one that I've finished porting, and it's ready to go to the shop and get the valve job touched up, checked out, and then it's going to go on my engine. So we'll look at some hard numbers first. I did some measuring of the cross section of the intake ports, and I took some port opening measurements. So when I say port opening measurements, what I mean is the measurement that they give you here on your intake port on your window doesn't mean that that's going to be your usable area. And what I'm getting at there is, there's your port opening. Edelbrock's going to give you this number. They're not going to give you the actual cross section, the usable section there in the push rod pinch where your port neck's down. So I took measurements both ways. Let's take a look at that for starters. See where we're at here. Okay, so the OEM is a 192 intake, 1.625 exhaust. The Edelbrocks, whether you buy the LA or the Magnum version, are a 202 160. That's one thing I want to say here. There is a difference in heads between their LA and their Magnum version. They don't just have one casting that gets machined for different rocker arms. They've actually changed the chambers between the two heads, and that's something I'll touch on trick flow as well. That's somewhat disappointing. So on your intake port, on your OEM head, you can see how it shrinks there with that push rod pinch. So on your OEM head, you're 1.071 wide and 2.14 tall. Now that's your gasket measurement at the port. But after the horrible push rod pinch on small block Mopars, your usable measurement is only 0.824 wide. And interestingly, it grows when you get down in the pinch, when you get about a 1/4 inch inside the port. The OEM head actually opens up. The floor goes down and the roof goes up, and it opens up, which is unusual. That opens up to a 2.271, and your cross section area is 1.87 inches of usable port. What cross section is it's a measurement of the amount of air you can flow through that area before it becomes a restriction. So what I mean by cross section, and I'll touch on that down here. Okay, a 360 cubic inch engine at 6,500 RPM needs a minimum of a 2.14 cross section in order for the port to not be a restriction. That doesn't mean that 360 won't spin 7,000, 7,500 RPM, but it means that beyond 6,500 RPM, if you don't have that minimum 2.14 cross section, then that port is going to become a restriction. And there's some numbers there: a 318 at 7,000, 2.07, and a 408, a stroker small block Mopar at 6,000 is 2.21. I'm working on a 408, that's why I put those numbers down. So you look at your 187 cross section, and off the top of my head, I don't know, that'll take you 318 to 6,500. These Magnum motors never saw that kind of RPM, so what they designed in the OEM head was fine for the application. Interestingly, the out-of-the-box Edelbrock has a smaller cross-section. It measures a little bit wider at the pinch, but a little bit shorter in height. And so it's actually out of the box, cross-section wise, it is smaller than an OEM head. And then I ended up with a 2.3 cross-section on my ported Edelbrock when I was done. I ended up at my pinch 1.028 wide and 2.24 tall. So I ended up with a 2.3 cross-section. That's going to support my 408. You know, I'm looking to shift about 62, 6,300. So that's going to support my 408. The way I want you to think on cross-section is on a carburetor, on your typical whatever, 350 Chevy with a 650 carb. When you're wide open throttle and you watch your vacuum gauge, you watch your manifold vacuum, you know, you might have 12, 14 inches of vacuum at idle. When you go wide open throttle down the road, that vacuum should drop to near zero. Half of an inch of vacuum. If your manifold vacuum at wide open throttle going down the road is over 1.5 inches of vacuum, that's telling you you need a bigger carburetor. That's telling you that even wide open, the airflow through that carburetor is insufficient. That's a restriction. That's a choke point. That's the way cross-section works on these intake ports. It doesn't mean you're not going to spend 6,500 on a 187 cross-section on a 408 stroker, but it's going to fall on its face. It's going to be a restriction. So when I talk about cross-section numbers, that's the minimum cross-section you need for that port to not be a restriction. And then you can focus on intake flow, you can focus on the valve, you can focus on those aspects of it and no longer be held back horsepower-wise by your port window size. So there's the OEM numbers. There's the eddy numbers. And then there's my ported eddy numbers. Here's some bowl measurements on the OEM head. Bowl measurements on the Edelbrock head. And you can see here we're almost 1/4 inch bigger there in the bowl. 0.249 increase in the bowl. This is an out-of-the-box Edelbrock head. 0.231 increase in the throat, and out-of-the-box Edelbrock. And then here's my ported numbers. Now this is from stock. So from stock to ported, I'm in the bowl area, 0.263 bigger, and in the throat, 0.248. Almost a full 1/4 inch bigger in the throat. That's a huge change from stock. There's two main rules that all of you should be focused on when porting your heads. Unless you're the professional guy, you know, with your $1 million shop and you have the right equipment, there's two rules that everyone else should be following. Don't go over 90%, 91% of your intake valve diameter. Should try to keep it 89, 90% of your intake valve diameter on your throat. That's probably one of the most important rules. And that rule exists to keep you from fucking up ahead. That rule exists for your safety. So here's your intake valve, your valve job. Now this applies to the intake. This doesn't apply to the exhaust. Here's your multi-angles and your seat. And then this is your throat here. Your smallest point under the valve is your throat. And then you open up into the bowl. So if this is a 202 valve, your throat measurement should never be more than 90%. I actually ended up, after I came in and finished polishing, I'm 90.5%. So you should stay 90% or smaller on your measurement here in the throat of your intake valve. That will keep you from fucking up your $2,600 set of heads and hogging this out, because bigger is better, and you've killed the performance in them if you've wasted your money. That rule exists for you. So two rules: don't go over 90%, of your intake valve diameter on the throat, and don't fuck with the short side. Don't ever touch the short side. You can polish it, you can clean it up, but do not modify what was built into your short side. This is the first set of heads I modified. I think they're actually going to flow better, but I think I screwed up my engine combination by modifying them. I thought that short side was way too tall. I brought the short side down. I'm sure my flow numbers have gone up, but I think I have also killed my torque numbers. So those two rules are two rules that you should be following. So on your OEM head here, you can see the throat to valve. This on a 192 valve is 82%. A lot of room for improvement there. I didn't measure the unported Edelbrock. Actually, I did measure the unported Edelbrock. And then on the ported one, I ended up, after fully polishing and everything, 90.5%. That will keep me out of trouble because I don't have a flow bench. I don't have the accurate information to go beyond that 90%. The difference between a really good engine and completely screwing up your package is 90% to 94%. That's how small the window is. So don't think, well, you know, he said 90% and I'm 91.5. A percent doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference. The difference between a hot street engine, race engine, a guy that ported his to 90% and one that's completely screwed up is only 93, 94%. Even the pro guys won't go beyond that, and most of the time they don't touch the 93, 94% unless it's for a very specific combination and they've done a lot of research. So the window is very small. Don't take that 90%, think 91% is okay. It's not. Here's your measurements on the exhaust. This is the OEM head. There's your bowl. Now your width and your height there is the measurement on the port window, which is horrible on an OEM head. I know these Magnums flow. I'm not saying they don't. If you go from an LA head to a Magnum head on your LA block, you have absolutely made the right move. It's a far better improvement even than the 340X heads and the U heads and the J heads. A mildly worked Magnum head is going to be every bit as good as those heads, if not better. However, looking at it, you can see such a big port opening and such a big window, and then you can see how bad it necks down and how small your window really is. There's an out-of-the-box Edelbrock, quite a bit better from your OEM, noticeably better from your OEM. You know, here you've got a lot of floor, and I think this is a water passage here that necks down your port, and they've corrected that in the Edelbrock. And then here's a ported Edelbrock. Huge amount of change, just an absolute huge amount of change. So here's your Edelbrock out of the box. Okay, and your measurements there, you can see you're almost 1/10 of an inch bigger in the bowl. And then your width and your height on your exit port is almost 1/10 of an inch on width and 52 thousandths on height. And that's a ported Edelbrock. So I ended up there on width, almost 1/4 inch wider, 150 thousandths taller on height, and 136 thousandths bigger in the bowl. What else can we talk about on these heads? Let's talk about chamber, and let's talk about why I didn't like the Edelbrocks until I bought them, and the things that I do like about them. And this is a question for you guys because this is the only set of small block Mopar Edelbrock heads I bought. These are the 5.2, 5.9 Magnum version of the head. If you look at an OEM chamber here, okay, you've got the quench pad, you've got the heart-shaped design, but then they're flat over here on this part of the chamber. And as your intake path comes out here, It is, again, better than an LA head, but you still have this wall and you have another quench pad. Part of the reason for that is Mopar wasn't making you a race head. They weren't making you a hot rod head. They were making an OEM head for millions and millions of cars and trucks on the road. They had emissions requirements that they needed to meet. And so you've got another quench pad over here. Remember, they weren't trying to make you a hot rod head, a race head. They were making an OEM head for production. Now you jump over to the Edelbrock Magnum head, and I'm going to keep saying Magnum head because this is completely different here. This is a lot more like what you're going to see in a Brodix, high-end, you know, small block Chevy stuff, AFR stuff, really good flowing heads. And this is what you're going to see. This is going to help promote swirl in your chamber. It's going to help bring the intake in, and you can already see here it's going to allow it to draw all the way into the cylinder wall, and it's going to help promote swirl in the chamber. That's something that you don't have in the OEM design. And here's the thing that I'm getting at. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I believe Edelbrock's LA version of this head does not have that chamber. Everything I see tells me that Edelbrock copied the OEM chamber in their aluminum LA head and not on the Magnum head. I also believe that to be true for trick flows. I haven't owned the trick flows yet, but everything that I'm seeing shows me that the trick flows copied the same OEM chamber design. They didn't do anything to improve it there. They've got better ports, they've got better flow, they've got better valve jobs, they've got a lot of stuff better, but I believe both Edelbrock LA and trick flow copied that chamber and did nothing to improve that. That's what really turns me on about these Edelbrock Magnum heads, and that's why I think if I were building another one, even if I was building an LA engine, I think I would still buy the Magnum head for the better chamber design, and I would bolt that onto my LA engine, whether I re-drill the intake for the LA valve, the bolt angle, you know, whether I change that on the head or I modify the intake or whatever, I would use this head even if I was building an LA engine. Also, here's another thing, and again, let me know in the comments, you guys that own some of this stuff, if I'm wrong. So these are the push rod tunnels in the Edelbrock head. You can see there I've epoxied in a tube, and that's part of my port job. Okay, so I can go all the way through and break through the port wall on my pinch because I've got that tube in there. And it allowed me to just expose the tube, and then that's where I stopped. That's when I knew I was as thin as I can be on the wall. I was breaking through. That's the reason for the tube. That's something that the Edelbrock offers me. Something that I like because that made a huge difference. You remember, so look at our pitch on our OEM head, 0.824, 0.887 out of the box on the Eddy, and I took that 887 all the way out to a 1.028. Huge improvement on pinch, huge improvement on probably the biggest restriction in these heads, which is going to be that push rod pinch, which is why if you look at race stuff, W2 stuff, TA stuff, other stuff, the first thing they do is they move this push rod over. They move the whole tunnel over out of the intake port, and that's where they pick up their flow in a lot of the factory aftermarket race stuff, probably some of the Indy offerings. Then you get into needing an offset rocker arm, but that's the first thing they do. So if I can take that out to the absolute max by putting in those tubes, then I think that's a huge improvement on these heads. That's something Edelbrock offers. Now let's go back to our OEM head. Okay, our OEM head is an open design. We don't have push rod tunnels, and we can't do that. If we break through that wall here, if we break through that push rod pitch, then you've broken through into your engine, you've screwed up your head. So the one thing that I did yesterday when I was putting some tubes into this head, I haven't ported it or anything yet, but I was installing the tubes. I put some epoxy here and I'm going to build up a couple of layers of epoxy there. Now I can't get too thick because my push rod's got to ride inside here. The reason I built up the epoxy was just purely as a backing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to port my push rod pinch with my carbide bit, and as the wall gets very thin, I'm going to start to see discoloration. I'm going to start to see hot spots from the carbide bit on the wall. That's where I'll stop. I'll take it out real thin until I get some hot spots, and the epoxy is just going to serve as a backing to add some strength to that area that I know I'm going to make thin. I can't do as good a job as I could on the push rod tubes with the Edelbrocks, but that's still going to allow me to open up this cross section, which is your biggest restriction on these heads. It's going to allow me to open that up as far as I possibly can. I believe TrickFlow is the same thing. I believe they have the open design. So again, let me know in the comments, but I think they copied this design, which was a poor move on TrickFlow's part. I like TrickFlow. I have several sets of TrickFlow here in their big block offerings. I think they're probably the best bang for the buck head on the market. Even for you small block Mopar guys, if you're just buying something out of the box and you're bolting it on, you don't want to put any extra money or effort into it, I think the TrickFlow is a great improvement and the way to go. For anyone that's looking to put in more effort, looking to get more out of their engine, I'm disappointed in some of the choices that TrickFlow made in the small block Mopar offering. And I think this Edelbrock really shines here. And this is something you'll also see if you get into their old Victor heads. You'll see that in the Victor head as well. So then that got me curious, and you can see here, okay, is I thought, well, how much meat is there in there? I was kind of looking through the water jacket. Can I take this OEM head and can I try to mimic the swirl that's built in to this Edelbrock chamber? And I think I'm going to be successful at it. Here you can see where I've taken quite a bit out of this wall here. There was enough material for me to do that. And I'm going to try to get this chamber to work like the Edelbrock. I'm going to try to promote swirl here into my cylinder. That's another thing that I'm not going to get into on this video, talking about swirl, quench, talking about your air fuel. That's needs to be a separate video, but that's the reason for this modification here, and I think that may offer a huge improvement on these OEM heads. So I'll leave it at that. If you guys have any questions or there's anything you want me to measure, I probably won't touch this head until next Tuesday or Wednesday. So if there's something you're curious about seeing before it gets ported and modified, or there's something you want to see on this fully ported head, let me know. I'll leave you guys with the numbers there. I appreciate your time.